The ocean today is terrifying enough. You've got massive great whites prowling the shallows, colossal squids lurking in the depths, and God knows what else swimming around in places we've never even explored. But here's the thing that'll really mess with your head. The deeper you go back in time, the more absolutely nightmarish these waters become. We're talking about prehistoric seas that were essentially liquid hellscapes where evolution went completely bonkers and created monsters that would make your worst nightmares look like Saturday morning cartoons. Picture this for a second. You're floating in ancient waters where sunlight gave up trying to penetrate about half a mile above your head. The pressure would turn you into paste instantly. The temperature hovers just above freezing, and in this crushing pitch-black void, things weren't just surviving. They were absolutely dominating, growing to impossible sizes, developing the most twisted hunting strategies you could imagine, and perfecting ways to kill that were so effective they haven't changed them in hundreds of millions of years. See, back then, the deep ocean was where Mother Nature decided to throw her rule book out the window and start experimenting with pure horror. No sunlight meant no plants, which meant everything down there had to get seriously creative about finding their next meal. Some creatures evolved eyes so massive they could spot the faintest glimmer of light in total darkness. Others just said, forget it entirely, and went completely blind, relying on other senses to hunt. And then there were the really twisted ones that decided to make their own light, waving it around like some kind of underwater psychopath with a flashlight, luring prey to their doom. But here's what really gets under my skin about all this. These weren't just random freaks of nature that showed up for a few million years and then disappeared. These things were already ancient, when dinosaurs were still figuring out how to walk upright. They had perfected their nightmare strategies long before your ancestors were even a possibility. And the truly disturbing part is, we only know about the ones that left fossils behind. Most deep-sea creatures just dissolve when they die, their remains eaten away by acid until they vanish without leaving a single trace. So for every horrifying prehistoric monster we've discovered, there are probably dozens of even worse creatures that we'll never know existed. Just imagine that for a moment. There could be things that lived down there that were so terrifying, so alien, that they would make every monster movie ever made look like a children's bedtime story. The ancient deep ocean was essentially a horror film that ran continuously for 500 million years, starring creatures that would drive H.P. Lovecraft insane. We're talking about beings with eyes bigger than dinner plates, staring through eternal darkness, teeth that literally don't fit inside their mouths, and hunting strategies that haven't needed updating since before complex life even existed on land. Let me introduce you to one of these nightmares. Meet Ophthalmosaurus, a marine reptile that lived about 150 million years ago. This thing had eyes that were absolutely massive, each one measuring 9 inches across. That's bigger than most basketballs, mounted on the head of a creature that was built like a living torpedo. Now you might think, okay, big eyes, so what? Well, those weren't just for show. They were precision instruments designed for seeing in complete darkness while diving deeper than modern nuclear submarines go today. This reptile could hold its breath for over 20 minutes and plunge more than 3,000 feet down into water so dark you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Why would anything want to do that? Simple. Dinner was down there, and this thing had turned hunting in the abyss into an art form. While other marine reptiles were splashing around in shallow water eating regular fish, Ophthalmosaurus was down in the void, using those massive eyes to spot the tiniest hint of bioluminescence from unsuspecting prey. Picture something larger than a dolphin, but engineered like a biological missile, with eyes so enormous they had to be reinforced with rings of bone just to prevent them from collapsing under the immense pressure. And this wasn't some one-off evolutionary experiment. We found these creatures all across Europe, which means diving into the abyss to hunt tentacled monsters was apparently a popular career choice back then. That tells you something pretty disturbing about just how messed up the Jurassic oceans really were. But what if you didn't need massive eyes to be an absolute nightmare? Enter Phosphorosaurus, which was only 12 feet long. In the world of prehistoric sea monsters, that's basically a minnow. But here's what made this particular minnow absolutely terrifying. It had forward-facing eyes. You know what else has forward-facing eyes? Predators, not owls, hawks. Things that live to hunt and kill other things for a living. Most marine reptiles had eyes on the sides of their heads because they spent most of their time trying not to become someone else's lunch. But Phosphorosaurus had both eyes pointing straight ahead, giving it depth perception that would make a military sniper jealous. And those eyes were huge, probably taking up half its skull. This little monster was completely nocturnal. While all the big scary mosasaurs were sleeping off their day of terrorizing everything in sight, Phosphorosaurus was just getting started. It would cruise through the dark waters using those precision-guided eyes to pick off glowing fish and squid that thought they were safe under cover of darkness. We're talking about a reptile that figured out how to be an underwater owl 70 million years before actual owls even existed. It wasn't fast enough to chase down big prey in broad daylight, so it simply waited until dark and became the ocean's first serial killer. And here's the kicker. It lived in the waters around Japan. So, while T-Rex was stomping around on land, the prehistoric seas of Japan were being stalked by this small, precise killer with giant forward-facing eyes, cruising through the darkness and picking off anything foolish enough to light itself up. Most mosasaurs were built like buses, designed for brute force. This one was built like a scalpel, engineered for surgical precision in the art of killing. It represents the kind of evolutionary specialization that only happens when an environment is so brutal that only the most perfectly adapted predators can survive. And some of these deep-sea killers took an even more direct approach to the whole murder business. Take the Viperfish, which has been perfecting its nightmare appearance for 15 million years. These things have teeth so long they stick out of their mouths even when closed. We're not talking about normal teeth here. These are straight-up fangs that curve back toward their eyes because there's literally nowhere else for them to go. If a human had proportional fangs, they would be dragging on the ground when you walked. But here's where it gets really twisted. Viperfish use these teeth by ramming into their prey at full speed, tooth first. You'd think that hitting something with your face would mess up your skull pretty badly, but viperfish thought of that too. They evolved a built-in shock absorber system, with the first bone behind their head acting like a crumple zone that keeps their brain from turning into soup every time they spear something. This fish just hangs motionless in the dark, waiting for something to swim by. Then it fires itself forward like a living harpoon and impales whatever was unlucky enough to be in the neighborhood. There's no chase scene, no fancy hunting strategy, just pure, brutal, lethal efficiency. And the best part? They do this while glowing. Viperfish have lights all along their belly to camouflage themselves from below, and a little lure on their back to attract prey from above. They're basically floating death traps with neon signs that say free food here. And they're still doing this today, right now, somewhere in the deep ocean. They've been perfecting this exact same strategy for millions of years, and they're not planning to stop anytime soon. The deeper we go into these prehistoric waters, the more we realize that the ancient oceans weren't just dangerous. They were laboratories where evolution conducted its most twisted experiments, creating predators so perfectly adapted to their nightmare environment that they never needed to change. But the viperfish are practically cuddly compared to what's swimming around down there with them. The goblin shark looks like something designed by an alien who had only ever heard a vague description of what a shark should look like. Pink, flabby skin, a snout that belongs on a completely different animal, and a body that seems like it was assembled from spare parts. But none of that is the terrifying part. The terrifying part is what happens when it decides to feed. This thing can shoot its entire jaw forward about a foot outside its head. 1 second, you're looking at a weird pink shark, and the next second, there's suddenly a second mouthful of needle teeth where no mouth should be, grabbing whatever happened to be nearby. It's like a biological jack-in-the-box designed by someone with serious psychological issues. This creature has been pulling this exact same trick for 125 million years. We know this because we keep finding fossil goblin sharks that look identical to the ones drifting around in today's oceans. While everything else was evolving and adapting and trying new survival strategies, the goblin shark just sat there going, "Nah, I'm good. This nightmare mouth thing is working perfectly fine for me." And why would it bother changing? It lives so deep that nothing bothers it. It just floats around in the endless darkness, waiting for something to swim close enough to its face. Then boom, extendable horror mouth deploys, and dinner gets dragged back into its gullet. No chasing, no fighting, just cold mechanical efficiency. The weirdest part is we barely ever see them. They live so deep and are so rare that most marine biologists have never encountered a living one. But they're down there right now, drifting through the blackness with their telescoping nightmare mouths, doing exactly what they've been doing since before grass existed on Earth. Then there's the frilled shark, which looks completely normal until you get up close and realize this thing is basically a 6-foot-long swimming mouth that's been rehearsing the same routine for 80 million years. It has 300 teeth arranged in 25 rows, and every single tooth is shaped like a tiny trident. When I say tiny, each one is still big enough to do some serious damage. This shark moves through the water like an eel, all smooth and wavy, until something gets too close. Then it strikes forward and swallows prey that's half its own size whole. No chewing, no tearing apart, just straight down the hatch like some kind of biological garbage disposal. The really disturbing thing is how good it is at hiding. Frilled sharks live in underwater caves and crevices during the day, then emerge at night to hunt. For most of human history, we had no idea these things existed. We just kept finding their teeth in ancient rock formations and assuming they were extinct. Then, in the 1800s, some unfortunate fishermen hauled one up from the depths, and everyone realized these living fossils had never left. They'd been down there the entire time, slithering through underwater caverns and swallowing squid whole, while the rest of the world moved on without them. Right now, somewhere in the deep Atlantic, a frilled shark is probably coiled up in some dark cave waiting for nightfall, so it can hunt with the same 300-tooth design that worked perfectly when dinosaurs were still walking around. Evolution looked at this thing 80 million years ago and said, yeah, that's terrifying enough, and just left it alone. But even these modern horrors pale in comparison to what some ancient creatures came up with. Female anglerfish carry their own personal fishing rod with a glowing lure dangling from the end. They sit perfectly motionless in total darkness, waving this little light around until something swims over to investigate what they think might be an easy meal. Then they open their cavernous mouth and swallow whatever was dumb enough to fall for the oldest trick in the underwater book. That's not even the weird part, though. The weird part is the males. When a male anglerfish finds a female, he bites onto her and then never, ever lets go. His mouth literally fuses to her skin. His blood vessels connect to hers, and he becomes a permanent living tumor on the side of her body, whose only job is producing sperm when needed. This arrangement has been going on for 50 million years. 50 million years of males biting onto females and transforming into biological reproductive organs. The females are completely fine with this setup because finding a mate in the endless black void of the deep ocean is basically impossible any other way. The male doesn't even have a functioning digestive system once he attaches. He just hangs there, getting all his nutrients from the female's bloodstream, waiting for her to need his services. Some females swim around with multiple males grafted to their bodies at once, which means they're carrying several zombie boyfriends while doing all the hunting, surviving, and actual work. Evolution looked at the challenge of finding mates in infinite darkness and decided to make all the males into parasites. It works so well that dozens of different anglerfish species all use this exact same horrifying reproductive strategy. Going even deeper into the prehistoric timeline, we find creatures that make anglerfish look conventional. 430 million years ago, the ocean floor was literally splitting open and spewing out waters so scalding hot It should have killed everything for miles around. Instead, entire communities of tube worms moved in and built underwater cities around these volcanic vents. These weren't ordinary worms. They figured out how to survive next to underwater volcanoes by forming partnerships with bacteria. The bacteria would consume the toxic chemicals pouring out of the vents, and the worms would eat the bacteria. Everyone stayed happy, except anything trying to live anywhere else on the seafloor, because the whole area was basically a chemical wasteland. We know this happened because we keep discovering fossilized worm tubes and ancient rocks that formed around these hellish volcanic sites. Thousands of tubes clustered together around what used to be black smokers shooting out 700-degree water. These worms had no eyes, no mouths, and no way to catch food independently. They just sat in their tubes, letting their bacterial roommates do all the work. 400 million years later, tube worms are still the only creatures tough enough to live right next to underwater lava geysers, using the exact same bacterial partnership with the exact same species. Most creatures spend their time avoiding getting cooked alive. Tube worms spent 4 centuries perfecting the art of living inside natural pressure cookers and turning poison into dinner. The really wild thing is that these volcanic vent sites don't last long. The volcano shuts down, the chemistry changes, and the entire community has to relocate and find a new vent somewhere else. Somehow, these worms have been playing this game of volcanic musical chairs for nearly 500 million years, always managing to find the next underwater hellscape to call home. These ancient seas were filled with survival strategies so bizarre they seem like science fiction. But perhaps the most incredible hiding success story belongs to the coelacanth. In 1938, a museum curator got a phone call about a strange fish caught off the coast of South Africa. When she went to examine it, she immediately knew she was looking at something that was supposed to have been extinct for 66 million years. The coelacanth had been playing the ultimate game of hide-and-seek, while everything else dealt with asteroid impacts, ice ages, and whatever other disasters were reshaping the surface world. Coelacanths just moved into deep underwater caves and decided to sit out the entire modern era. Scientists had been finding coelacanth fossils for decades, dating back to fish that lived 360 million years ago. They assumed these things died out with the dinosaurs. Turns out they just got incredibly good at avoiding detection. They were hanging out in caves 600 feet down, emerging only at night to hunt, basically living the exact same lifestyle their ancestors had maintained since before trees existed. The fish caught in 1938 caused such a sensation that researchers offered rewards for anyone who could find another specimen. It took 14 years to locate a second living coelacanth. When scientists finally got to study living specimens, they discovered these fish hadn't bothered evolving much of anything during their millions of years in hiding. Same bizarre fins, same strange skulls, same unusual method of giving birth to live young instead of laying eggs. While everything else was adapting and evolving, coelacanths were in their caves essentially saying, "Nah, we're good. See you in a few million years." The deeper we venture into these prehistoric waters, both literally and chronologically, the more we discover that the ancient oceans weren't just home to bigger versions of modern sea life. They were alien worlds where the rules of biology seemed completely different, where creatures existed that challenge our understanding of what's possible in the natural world. But there's one group of ancient creatures that took the concept of underwater forests to a completely different level. Imagine swimming through what looks like an alien landscape, where towering animals sway in the current like massive underwater trees. That's exactly what the seafloor looked like when sea lilies dominated the ancient oceans. These weren't plants, and they definitely weren't flowers, despite their name. They were animals that had figured out the most successful lifestyle strategy in prehistoric ocean history. Some of these underwater trees grew 60 feet tall, taller than most buildings, anchored to the seafloor by root-like structures and waving their feathery arms through the water to snatch whatever food drifted by. Picture entire underwater forests, stretching for miles in every direction, thousands upon thousands of these living trees creating dense canopies on the ancient sea floor. They were so successful at this strategy that they completely dominated marine ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. Being a giant stationary flower was apparently the way to go if you wanted to rule the prehistoric seas. The fossils of these things are so common that entire mountain ranges are basically made of nothing but dead sea lily parts. Limestone cliffs composed entirely of their broken stems and arms literally hold geological formations built from the remains of these ancient underwater forests. That's how abundant they were and how long they dominated the oceans. Most of them got wiped out during the massive extinction event at the end of the Permian period, but some species looked at the apocalypse happening around them and decided to just move deeper. They relocated to the abyss and kept doing their thing. We didn't even realize they were still alive until the 1800s, when deep-sea expeditions finally dragged some up from the depths. Today, there are still sea lilies down there, standing around on the ocean floor like living fossils, waving their arms in the current and catching whatever happens to float by. They're not as tall as their ancestors, and there aren't nearly as many of them, but they're still out there being underwater flowers after 300 million years of practice. Now let me tell you about what might be the most metal name ever given to a prehistoric creature, Ophthalmosaurus, which literally translates to bottomless lizard. And unlike most dinosaur names that sound way cooler than the actual animal, this one absolutely earned its terrifying title. This was a plesiosaur that took one look at the deepest, darkest parts of the prehistoric ocean and said, "That's where I want to live permanently, not just visit for hunting trips, but full-time residence in the abyss." So it evolved the heaviest, densest bones of any marine reptile ever discovered, thick, solid bones that worked like built-in lead weights to drag it down into the crushing depths. Most marine reptiles had lightweight, hollow bones to help them float and swim efficiently near the surface. Ophthalmosaurus went the complete opposite direction and basically turned its entire skeleton into a diving suit made of bone. It wanted to sink, and it wanted to stay sunk in the deepest parts of the ocean, where no other creature dared to venture. This thing had lungs the size of oil drums to store enough oxygen for extended deep dives into water so deep that the pressure would instantly crush any surface-dwelling creature. Then it would drop like a biological anchor into the total darkness and cruise just above the seafloor with those massive eyes scanning for anything foolish enough to be wandering around in the void. Small head, incredibly long neck, perfect for darting forward like a striking snake to grab squid or deep-sea fish before they even knew what hit them. This wasn't some short-lived evolutionary experiment that lasted a few thousand years. Abyssosaurus was perfecting this lifestyle for millions of years during the early Cretaceous period. While other plesiosaurs were playing around in shallow lagoons and coastal waters, this absolute unit was hanging out in the deepest, most hostile parts of the ocean, living a lifestyle that wouldn't be out of place in a modern horror movie. The name says it all. Bottomless lizard. It literally made the bottom of the ocean its permanent address. But even further north, things got exponentially weirder in the ancient seas. There was a plesiosaur called Ophthalmosaurus that lived near the Arctic Circle 145 million years ago. This meant it had to deal with months of complete darkness during the polar winter, when the sun never rose above the horizon, and the ocean became an endless black void. Most reptiles would have looked at that situation and decided it was time to migrate somewhere warmer. Ophthalmosaurus saw it as the ultimate business opportunity. This creature had developed enormous eyes that pointed straight up toward the surface like biological, per its entire existence, scopes. It spent staring at the ceiling of the ocean, waiting for something to swim overhead so it could spot the silhouette against whatever microscopic amount of light might be filtering down. When it detected movement above, it would rise from the bottom like something out of a deep-sea nightmare movie and grab whatever unfortunate creature happened to be swimming overhead. But here's the really bizarre part that has scientists scratching their heads. They've found rocks in this thing's stomach. Not fish bones, not squid beaks, but actual stones. Oh! The leading theory is that it was using these rocks as ballast, swallowing them to help control its buoyancy for those vertical hunting attacks. Imagine being so specialized for hunting in complete darkness that you're literally eating rocks to fine-tune your ability to ambush prey from below. Going even deeper into the prehistoric timeline, we encounter something that made what might be the worst evolutionary decision in ocean history. Trilobites had dominated the seas for over 200 million years with some of the most sophisticated eyes ever developed. These compound eyes had perfect crystal lenses that could see better than most creatures alive today. Then, some populations of these successful, well-adapted animals looked at the deep ocean and made a choice that seems absolutely insane. They voluntarily gave up sight entirely. They evolved smooth, blank spaces where their amazing eyes used to be. No pupils, no lenses, absolutely nothing. They became completely blind and moved into the darkest parts of the ocean, where they spent hundreds of millions of years feeling around in the mud for dead things to eat. This wasn't a gradual process either. One generation had perfectly functional eyes, and their descendants just didn't. It was like they decided that seeing was overrated, and crawling around blind on the seafloor was somehow a better lifestyle choice. But apparently It worked incredibly well for them because blind trilobites were absolutely everywhere in the deep ocean. Thousands of them feeling their way around in the darkness with their antennae, bumping into each other, stepping on dead fish, living their best lives without having any idea what anything actually looked like. They survived multiple mass extinction events this way. If you can't see the asteroid coming, there's no point worrying about it. The last trilobites on Earth were probably these blind deep-sea species still crawling around in the mud, still feeling for food with their antennae, completely unaware that they were the final survivors of one of the most successful animal groups in the planet's history. But today's deep ocean has its own version of these unstoppable scavengers, and they look like something straight out of your worst nightmares. Giant isopods are what happens when you take a regular pill bug from your garden and feed it nothing but protein supplements and growth hormones for 30 million years. These things are the size of footballs and can survive without eating for 5 entire years. Let me repeat that, because it's absolutely insane. 5 years without food. There's a giant isopod in captivity that refused to eat for half a decade and then just died, probably to prove a point to humans about how little we understand their biology. They live on the deep ocean floor where food is so incredibly scarce that when something finally dies and sinks down to their level, it's like winning the lottery. Hundreds of these massive ocean bugs will detect the smell from miles away and come swarming to the carcass like the world's most disturbing family reunion. Once they locate a dead whale or large fish, they'll gorge themselves until they're so stuffed they can barely move, literally like the ocean's version of Thanksgiving dinner. Then they'll just sit there for months, maybe years, slowly digesting their meal while waiting for the next thing to die and fall from the surface world above. The most unsettling part is how incredibly good they are at waiting. Most animals would starve to death within weeks without food. Giant isopods have turned patience into an art form. They'll remain perfectly motionless on the seafloor, doing absolutely nothing for longer than most human civilizations have existed. And when they do encounter a potential predator, they don't run or fight. They just roll up into a ball and wait for the threat to get bored and leave. They're essentially the ocean's version of that person who deals with all their problems by pretending they don't exist. 30 million years of evolution, and their survival strategy is eating once every few years and avoiding confrontation at all costs. Even these bizarre survivors look completely normal compared to some of the truly alien creatures that once inhabited these waters. Scientists discovered a fossil that looked like someone had taken a giant squid shell and bent it into a paperclip shape, then decided that was a perfectly reasonable way to exist for 2 centuries. This was Diplomaceras, and yes, you heard that correctly. Individual specimens live for 200 years. This creature outlived entire dinosaur species while shaped like office supplies. There are very few things on Earth that can survive longer than 2 centuries. Most animals are lucky to see a few decades. Most ammonites curled their shells into efficient spiral shapes because that design made sense from an engineering perspective. Diplomaceras looked at millions of years of successful shell evolution and said, actually, what if I just grew in a giant U shape instead? Then it spent the next 2 centuries floating around the ancient ocean, looking like a 10-foot-tall paperclip with tentacles. The shell shape was so bizarre that when paleontologists first discovered these fossils, they assumed they were looking at multiple different animals that had somehow gotten stuck together. Nobody could believe that a single creature would voluntarily grow itself into that configuration and then live with the consequences for 200 years. But the paperclip lifestyle apparently worked out great. Diplomocera's would float vertically in the water with its head hanging down from the bottom of the U, just hovering there and grabbing whatever happened to swim by. The same individual ammonite could occupy the same spot in the ocean for longer than some countries have existed as nations. Scientists counted the growth rings in fossilized shells and found 200 of them, which means these things were already ancient when they were still alive. Evolution had spent millions of years perfecting the spiral shell design, and then Ophthalmosaurus showed up and decided to reinvent the wheel as a pretzel. But even that weirdness pales in comparison to the ocean's first truly alien life forms. 565 million years ago, long before fish existed, before sharks, before basically any animal you would recognize, the deep ocean floor was covered with things that looked like they'd been designed by extraterrestrials who had never seen Earth life before. Charnia was a 2-meter-tall feather made of living tissue that had no mouth, no stomach, no eyes, and no way to move. It just stood there on the seafloor, swaying gently in the current, absorbing nutrients directly through its skin from the surrounding water. And it did this for tens of millions of years. No predators existed yet, so nothing bothered it. No competition for food, so it didn't need to hunt or fight for resources. No evolutionary pressure to change quickly, so it remained exactly the same, doing exactly nothing for longer than complex life has existed anywhere else on things cover the planet. These the ancient seafloor in vast fields that stretched for miles, thousands of them, all identical, all motionless, all just standing there absorbing chemicals from seawater, while the rest of Earth slowly figured out what this whole evolution thing was supposed to accomplish. They had fractal patterns built into their bodies that repeated at every level of magnification. Perfectly mathematical designs that wouldn't look out of place in a modern computer program, except this was 500 million years before mathematics or computers or anything that should have been able to create patterns that precise even existed. When Charnia finally went extinct, it left absolutely no descendants. Nothing alive today is even remotely related to it. It was an evolutionary experiment that ran for 30 million years and then completely vanished, leaving only fossils to prove these alien creatures ever existed on our planet. The deeper we dive into these prehistoric oceans, both in terms of depth and time, the more we realize that we've barely scratched the surface of the true weirdness that once populated our planet's waters. These ancient seas were testing grounds for biological designs so bizarre, so alien, that they challenge everything we think we know about what's possible in the natural world. And these alien feather creatures represent just the beginning of the prehistoric ocean's descent into complete biological madness. Because as we venture even deeper into these ancient waters, we start encountering survival strategies so twisted they seem like they were dreamed up by someone having a fever nightmare about evolutionary biology. Take the creatures that decided the best way to survive was to become living architecture. Ancient reefs weren't built by corals like today. They were constructed by massive organisms called rudists that looked like someone had crossed a clam with a skyscraper and then let it grow for millions of years. These things could reach heights of 6 feet or more, and they didn't just build reefs. They became the reefs. Imagine underwater cities made entirely of living shells stretching for hundreds of miles across the ancient seafloor. Each individual rudist was basically a biological apartment building, filtering water and catching food while simultaneously serving as the foundation for an entire ecosystem. They were so successful at this strategy that they dominated shallow tropical seas for over 100 million years. But what makes them truly disturbing is how they reproduced. Instead of spawning like normal mollusks, many species would literally grow smaller versions of themselves directly on their shells. Parent rudists would be covered in dozens of their own offspring, creating these nightmarish shell cities where multiple generations lived stacked on top of each other like some kind of biological housing project from hell. When the asteroid hit at the end of the Cretaceous period, it wiped out these reef-building giants completely. Today's coral reefs are basically the ocean's attempt to rebuild what the rudists had perfected millions of years earlier. And they're still not even close to matching what these ancient shell cities could accomplish. But if you think living architecture is weird, wait until you hear about the creatures that turned cannibalism into a fine art. Helicoprion was a shark-like creature with what might be the most bizarre feeding apparatus ever evolved. Instead of normal shark teeth, this thing had a lower jaw that curved into a perfect spiral filled with teeth, creating what looked like a biological buzzsaw hanging out of its mouth. For decades, scientists couldn't figure out how this thing actually used its weird spiral tooth whirl. Some thought it was for crushing shells. Others suggested it was for slicing up soft prey. But recent research suggests something far more disturbing. Helicoprion was probably using that spiral saw to slice up other Helicoprion. Picture this nightmare scenario. These creatures would swim up to each other and use their buzzsaw jaws to carve spiral-shaped chunks of flesh out of their own species. Not to kill them necessarily, but to feed on them while they were still alive. It was like an underwater horror movie where the monsters were dining on each other in the most methodical, surgical way possible. And they were doing this for 25 million years. That's 25 million years of sharks swimming around with built-in carving knives, systematically butchering their own kind in the most efficient way evolution could devise. They finally went extinct, probably because they got so good at eating each other that they ran out of things to eat. Moving deeper into the prehistoric timeline, we encounter creatures that make Helicoprion look cuddly. The Cambrian explosion, which happened about 540 million years ago was when life decided to throw its biggest party and invite every nightmare creature it could possibly imagine. This wasn't just evolution getting creative. This was evolution completely losing its mind and seeing how weird it could make things before reality stepped in and said, "That's enough." Ophthalmosaurus was one of the party guests, and it looked like someone had tried to design an animal while having a psychotic break. It had 5 eyes arranged on top of its head like a biological crown, and instead of a normal mouth, it had a long, flexible proboscis with a claw on the end. Not just any claw, but a grasping claw that it would use to grab prey and stuff them into a mouth that was located on the underside of its head. So this thing would float through the ancient seas, scanning the environment with its 5-eye array, then use its face tentacle to grab whatever looked tasty and shove it into its backward mouth. It was like nature tried to design the most impractical feeding system possible, and then decided to run with it for millions of years. But Ophthalmosaurus was practically normal compared to Wawaksia, which looked like someone had covered a slug with medieval armor and then stuck spikes all over it for good measure. This creature was basically a living pincushion that crawled across the seafloor, scraping up organic matter with its radula, which is basically a biological cheese grater made of teeth. The armor plating wasn't just for protection either. Recent research suggests that Wawaksia could actually control the angle and position of its spikes, turning its entire body into a dynamic weapon system. Predators approaching from different angles would be met with carefully positioned spikes that could pivot and adjust to maximize damage potential. And then there was hallucinogenia, which earned its name because scientists thought they were hallucinating when they first tried to reconstruct what this thing actually looked like. It had rows of spikes along its back for protection and rows of tentacle-like legs underneath for walking. But here's the kicker. Scientists initially thought they had the whole animal upside down and backwards. For years, they were displaying fossils with the creature's head where its tail should be and its belly where its back belonged. It took decades of research to figure out which end was which and which side was up. Even today, there's debate about exactly how this thing moved and fed. It's like evolution was deliberately trying to create something so confusing that future scientists would go insane trying to understand it. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these Cambrian creatures wasn't their bizarre appearance. It was their eyes. Many of them had compound eyes with thousands of individual lenses, giving them vision that was arguably more sophisticated than anything alive today. Trilobites had eyes with calcite lenses that could focus light underwater without distortion, something that took human engineers centuries to figure out how to do with manufactured lenses. These ancient creatures weren't just weird-looking, they were packing visual systems that were more advanced than most modern animals. They could see things in the ancient oceans that we can barely imagine, detecting wavelengths of light that don't even penetrate water today due to changes in atmospheric composition. And that brings us to one of the most unsettling realizations about prehistoric oceans. The water itself was different. The chemistry, was alien. Oxygen levels were wildly different from today, sometimes much higher, sometimes much lower. The pH was different. The temperature was different. Even the color of the water was probably different due to different concentrations of minerals and organic compounds. These creatures weren't just living in a different world. They were living in water that would be toxic to most modern marine life. The ancient seas were chemical soups that supported forms of life that simply couldn't exist in today's oceans. It's not just that these creatures are extinct. It's that the entire environment that made their existence possible has vanished from Earth. Some of the most successful ancient marine creatures were things called graptolites, which built colonial structures that looked like underwater apartment complexes made of organic material. Thousands of individual animals would live together in these floating cities. Each one specialized for different functions. Some were filter feeders, others were reproductive specialists, and some were essentially soldiers whose job was to defend the colony. These floating cities would drift through the ancient oceans like biological spaceships, with each individual organism contributing to the survival of the whole. When one of these colonies encountered food, they would all coordinate their feeding activities. When they encountered danger, they would all respond as a single organism with thousands of parts. But what made graptolites truly alien was their reproduction strategy. Instead of reproducing individually, the entire colony would sometimes sacrifice itself to create a new generation. The adult colony would literally dissolve, with all the individual organisms dying simultaneously to release their genetic material and create the next generation of colonies. Picture floating cities in the ancient oceans that would periodically commit collective suicide to reproduce. Entire civilizations of microscopic animals choosing death as a community so that their species could continue. It's a level of biological coordination that makes modern insect colonies look chaotic and disorganized. And these graptolite cities were everywhere in the ancient seas. For hundreds of millions of years, they were one of the dominant forms of life in the oceans, creating vast floating networks of colonial organisms that covered thousands of square miles of open water. When they finally went extinct, they left behind some of the most beautiful fossils ever discovered, intricate organic structures that looked like delicate lacework preserved in stone. But even graptolites pale in comparison to the truly massive creatures that once ruled these prehistoric waters. We're not just talking about things that were bigger than modern whales. We're talking about creatures that were so large they challenge our understanding of what's physically possible for a living organism. Leadsichthys was a fish that reached lengths of over 50 feet, making it larger than most modern whales. But unlike whales, which are mammals with sophisticated respiratory systems, this was a fish with gills trying to extract oxygen from water to support a body mass that seems impossible for a gill-breathing creature. How did it manage to grow so large? The answer lies in the ancient ocean's chemistry. Oxygen levels in the water were much higher than today, allowing fish to grow to sizes that would be impossible in modern seas. But that's not the weird part. The weird part is what it ate. Despite being larger than most whales, Leedsichthys was a filter feeder that survived entirely on plankton and small fish. Imagine a creature the size of a school bus, cruising through the ancient oceans with its mouth wide open, straining tiny organisms from the water like a biological vacuum cleaner. It was basically a prehistoric blue whale, except it was a fish that lived in an ocean with completely different chemistry. And it wasn't alone. The ancient seas were filled with gigantic filter-feeding fish that would make modern whale sharks look like minnows. These creatures were processing massive volumes of water every day, filtering out microscopic organisms and fundamentally altering the chemistry of the ancient oceans through their feeding activities. But size wasn't the only way ancient marine creatures achieved dominance. Some of them developed chemical warfare strategies that were so effective they could kill everything in their immediate vicinity without even trying. Ancient cyanobacteria would periodically bloom in such massive numbers that they would poison entire sections of ocean, creating dead zones that could persist for thousands of years. These weren't accidental environmental disasters. These were biological weapons deployed by organisms that had figured out how to eliminate all competition by making the water itself toxic to other forms of life. They would multiply exponentially, consuming all available nutrients and producing chemical compounds that were lethal to everything else in the ecosystem. The really disturbing part is that these toxic blooms were often triggered by exactly the kinds of environmental changes that human activity is causing in today's oceans. Rising temperatures, changing pH levels, and altered nutrient concentrations would cause these ancient bacterial populations to explode and turn vast areas of ocean into biological wastelands. And when these blooms finally ended, usually because they had poisoned themselves along with everything else, they would leave behind layers of organic material that would eventually become some of the world's largest oil deposits. The fossil fuels we burn today are literally the compressed remains of ancient bacterial warfare campaigns that turned prehistoric oceans into chemical battlefields. But perhaps the most alien aspect of these ancient seas was how they sounded. Modern oceans are filled with the calls of whales, the clicking of dolphins, and the various sounds made by fish and crustaceans. Prehistoric oceans would have been filled with sounds that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. Imagine the acoustic signature of a 50-foot fish filter, feeding through water with different density and chemical composition. Picture the sounds made by colonial organisms coordinating their activities across floating cities, miles in diameter. Think about the noise created by massive reef-building creatures growing their shell skyscrapers on the sea floor. These ancient waters would have been filled with biological symphonies that were completely unlike anything in today's oceans. Sound travels differently through water with different chemistry, and the creatures making these sounds had acoustic systems that were adapted to prehistoric ocean conditions that no longer exist. The deeper we dive into these ancient waters, the more we realize that we're not just looking at extinct animals. We're looking at an entirely different planet, where the oceans themselves were alien environments that supported forms of life so bizarre they seem like science fiction. These prehistoric seas were testing grounds for biological experiments that were so successful they dominated Earth's waters for hundreds of millions of years. And the truly unsettling part is that we're only seeing the tiniest fraction of what actually lived down there. For every fossil we found, there were probably thousands of species that left no trace behind. The deep ocean was, and still is, Earth's greatest frontier, hiding creatures and ecosystems that exist beyond the reach of sunlight and human understanding. The ancient oceans weren't just deeper and darker than today's seas. They were fundamentally different worlds, populated by creatures that evolved under conditions so alien that their very existence challenges everything we think we know about what life on Earth can accomplish, and somewhere in the deepest parts of today's oceans, descendants of these ancient nightmares are still down there, continuing evolutionary experiments that began hundreds of millions of years ago. The prehistoric oceans weren't done showing off their capacity for biological horror. As we push even further back through time, we encounter creatures that make everything we've discussed so far look like cuddly pets. These ancient waters were home to predators so perfectly engineered for killing that they redefined what it means to be an apex hunter. Enter Ophthalmosaurus, a creature that dominated the Cambrian seas like an underwater death machine designed by someone's worst nightmares. This thing grew over 6 feet long at a time when most other animals were smaller than your thumb. In the ancient oceans, that made it basically Godzilla with fins and grasping arms that could snatch prey from ridiculous distances. But what made Ophthalmosaurus truly terrifying wasn't just its size. It was how it hunted. This creature had flexible front appendages that worked like biological fishing nets, except instead of catching fish, they were designed to grab other animals and stuff them into a circular mouth lined with razor-sharp plates. Picture a giant underwater shrimp with arms that could reach out and pluck you from the water, then feed you into a mouth that looked like a biological garbage disposal. And those eyes, sweet merciful hell, those eyes. Ophthalmosaurus had compound eyes over 3 inches across, each one containing over 16,000 individual lenses. That's more visual processing power than most modern insects packed into the head of a 6-foot killing machine that ruled the ancient seas 500 million years ago. But here's what really messes with your head about this creature. It wasn't some primitive evolutionary dead end. This thing was so successful at being a predator that it essentially invented the concept of being an apex hunter in marine environments. Before Ophthalmosaurus, the oceans were filled with small scavengers and filter feeders just trying to survive. After Ophthalmosaurus showed up, every other creature in the sea had to completely redesign their survival strategies. The fossil evidence shows bite marks on trilobites that match perfectly with Ophthalmosaurus feeding apparatus. These things were literally reshaping the evolution of defensive armor by being so good at cracking open shells that their prey had to develop increasingly elaborate protection just to survive. It was an underwater arms race that lasted millions of years. Moving deeper through the prehistoric timeline, we encounter something that challenges our basic understanding of what marine predators can accomplish. Dunkleosteus was a fish that grew 30 feet long and had a bite force that could crush a car, not damage a car, crush it into a cube. But this wasn't even technically a shark. It was a placoderm, an armored fish with bony plates instead of teeth. Those plates formed cutting edges that were self-sharpening, meaning every time this monster bit down on something, its weapons got sharper. It was like having a mouthful of biological guillotines that improved with use. The bite force calculations for Dunkleosteus are absolutely insane. We're talking about 11,000 pounds per square inch of crushing pressure. That's enough force to bite through steel. This fish could have bitten a great white shark in half without even trying. And it was doing this 70 million years before dinosaurs figured out how to be properly terrifying on land. But what makes Dunkleosteus even more disturbing is how it fed. Recent analysis of stomach contents shows that these things were cannibals that would regurgitate partially digested prey when they needed to make room for bigger meals. They were basically underwater garbage disposals that would eat anything, including each other, and puke up whatever didn't fit to make space for the next victim. Picture schools of these 30-foot armored nightmares cruising through the ancient seas, biting each other in half and vomiting up the pieces they couldn't swallow whole. It was like someone took the concept of apex predator and decided to add psychological warfare to the mix. And just when you think prehistoric marine predators couldn't get any more twisted, we discover creatures that turned hunting into performance art. Helicoprion wasn't content with just having weird spiral teeth. Some species developed feeding strategies that were so elaborate they seemed like they were designed by a serial killer with a degree in marine biology. These creatures would apparently use their buzzsaw jaws to create precise spiral wounds on prey, then follow their victims for days while they slowly bled to death. It wasn't about quick kills. It was about maximizing suffering while ensuring the prey couldn't escape. They had essentially invented underwater torture as a feeding strategy. The fossil evidence shows spiral-shaped bite marks on other marine reptiles that healed over, meaning the victim survived the initial attack and lived with these horrific wounds for extended periods. Helicoprion was practicing a form of slow-motion predation that combined precision surgery with psychological warfare. But even these nightmare predators had to share the ancient oceans with creatures that took the concept of biological weapons to even more disturbing extremes. Some prehistoric cephalopods developed shells that weren't just for protection. They were chemical warfare laboratories. These ancient relatives of squid and octopus would concentrate toxins from their prey and store them in specialized chambers within their shells. When threatened, they could release these concentrated poisons directly into the water, creating toxic clouds that would kill everything in their immediate vicinity. They were basically swimming chemical weapons factories disguised as mollusks. The really twisted part is that they would often use this ability not for defense, but for hunting. They would position themselves near schools of fish, release their poison clouds, and then feast on the paralyzed victims floating around them. It was biological warfare as a dinner strategy. Going even deeper into the prehistoric oceans, we find evidence of creatures that developed hunting strategies so alien they seem like they belong on a different planet entirely. Some ancient arthropods evolved sensory systems that could detect the electrical fields generated by other living creatures. But they didn't just use this ability to locate prey. They figured out how to generate their own electrical fields to interfere with their victims' nervous systems. These things were essentially underwater hackers that could take control of other creatures' bodies and force them to swim directly into their mouths. Imagine being hunted by something that could override your nervous system and turn your own body against you. These predators would send out electrical pulses that would cause their prey to lose muscular control and helplessly drift toward their waiting jaws. It was mind control weaponized for predation. The fossil record shows evidence of mass mortality events where hundreds of small marine creatures all died simultaneously in the same area with no signs of physical trauma. Scientists now believe these were the result of electrical predators, using their neural warfare capabilities on entire schools of prey at once. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these prehistoric marine ecosystems wasn't the individual predators. It was how they worked together. Recent research has uncovered evidence that some ancient marine creatures engaged in cooperative hunting behaviors that were far more sophisticated than anything we see in modern oceans. Giant cephalopods would coordinate with massive arthropods to create underwater hunting parties that could take down prey much larger than themselves. They had developed communication systems and tactical strategies that allowed them to function as biological military units. Fossil sites show evidence of coordinated attacks where multiple predator species would surround large herbivorous marine reptiles and attack simultaneously from different angles. These weren't random feeding frenzies. These were planned military operations carried out by creatures with brains smaller than walnuts. The really chilling part is that these cooperative hunting behaviors disappeared from the fossil record around the same time that many of the largest marine predators went extinct. It's like the ancient oceans had developed their own version of organized warfare, and when the key players died out, the entire system collapsed. Moving forward through the prehistoric timeline, we encounter marine ecosystems that were essentially underwater battlefields where every creature was both predator and prey simultaneously. The ancient seas had evolved into environments where the only way to survive was to become increasingly specialized at killing, while simultaneously developing better ways to avoid being killed. Some creatures solved this problem by becoming living fortresses. Ancient nautiloids developed shells with internal chambers that could be rapidly filled or emptied with water, allowing them to adjust their buoyancy instantly. But they didn't just use this for swimming. They turned it into a weapon system. These creatures could rapidly alter their buoyancy to slam into prey from above like biological torpedoes, using their shells as impact weapons while simultaneously injecting neurotoxins through specialized appendages. They were essentially underwater-guided missiles with chemical warheads. But other creatures took the opposite approach and became masters of stealth and deception. Some ancient cephalopods developed camouflage abilities that were so sophisticated they could mimic not just the appearance of other creatures, but their behavior patterns as well. These things would disguise themselves as harmless bottom dwellers, perfectly imitating their movements and feeding behaviors until prey came close enough to attack. But they took it further than just visual mimicry. They could apparently reproduce the chemical signatures of the creatures they were impersonating, essentially becoming biological spies that could infiltrate other species. The fossil evidence shows attack patterns that suggest these stealth predators could maintain their disguises for extended periods, sometimes following prey for days while perfectly mimicking harmless creatures until the perfect moment to strike. They had essentially mastered the art of underwater identity theft as a hunting strategy. And then there were the creatures that turned the entire concept of predator and prey relationships upside down. Some ancient marine organisms developed parasitic relationships that were so sophisticated they essentially turned their hosts into biological puppets. These parasites would infect larger marine creatures and slowly take control of their nervous systems, eventually controlling their host's behavior completely. But instead of just using their victims for food, they would force them to seek out other hosts, turning infected creatures into biological weapons that would spread the parasites to new victims. Picture prehistoric oceans filled with zombie-like marine creatures that had lost control of their own bodies and were being controlled by microscopic puppet masters. These infected hosts would behave normally most of the time, but when the parasites needed to reproduce or find new hosts, they would completely override their victims' survival instincts. The really disturbing part is that some of these parasitic relationships were so successful that they persisted for millions of years. Entire marine ecosystems developed around these host-parasite dynamics, with some species evolving specifically to take advantage of infected creatures, while others developed elaborate defenses against parasitic infection. But even these nightmare scenarios pale in comparison to what happened when prehistoric marine ecosystems reached their breaking points. The ancient oceans periodically experienced what scientists now call biological cascade events, where the collapse of one predator species would trigger the explosive evolution of dozens of new predator types, all competing to fill the vacant ecological niche. These evolutionary arms races would happen incredibly quickly by geological standards, with new predator species evolving and going extinct within a few million years as they competed for dominance in rapidly changing marine ecosystems. The fossil record shows periods where marine predator diversity would explode exponentially, creating underwater environments that were essentially biological warfare laboratories. During these periods, the ancient oceans would become testing grounds for increasingly extreme survival strategies. Creatures would evolve bizarre combinations of offensive and defensive capabilities, creating marine monsters that seemed like they were designed by a committee of horror movie directors. Some species developed multiple redundant killing systems, with primary weapons backed up by secondary and tertiary attack mechanisms, in case their main predatory adaptations failed. Others evolved modular body plans that allowed them to literally rebuild themselves if they lost limbs or organs during combat with other predators. The really mind-bending part is that these evolutionary arms races would sometimes result in predator species that were so specialized for killing specific prey that they would go extinct when their target species disappeared. The ancient oceans were filled with biological weapons that were so finely tuned for destruction that they couldn't survive without constant warfare. And throughout all of this biological chaos, the deep ocean remained the ultimate testing ground for life's most extreme experiments. The crushing pressure, eternal darkness, and chemical composition of the ancient deep sea created conditions where normal evolutionary rules didn't apply. Down there in the abyss, creatures evolved that seemed to violate basic principles of biology. Some developed metabolisms that could function without any external energy source, essentially creating perpetual motion machines made of living tissue. Others evolved sensory systems that could detect quantum-level fluctuations in their environment, giving them awareness of their surroundings that borders on supernatural. The ancient deep ocean was where life pushed the boundaries of what's physically possible, creating creatures that challenge our understanding of the fundamental limits of biological systems. And the most terrifying part is that we're still finding evidence of these impossible organisms in the deepest parts of today's oceans. Recent deep-sea expeditions have discovered creatures that appear to be virtually unchanged descendants of these ancient impossibilities, still thriving in environments that should be completely hostile to complex life. They're living fossils that have maintained biological capabilities that modern science can barely explain, let alone replicate. These discoveries suggest that the deepest parts of our oceans are still home to evolutionary experiments that began hundreds of millions of years ago and never stopped. The ancient ocean's most extreme creations didn't go extinct. They just moved deeper, continuing their biological arms races in environments so hostile that we can barely explore them with our most advanced technology. And as we develop better tools for deep-sea exploration, we keep finding evidence that these ancient evolutionary battlefields are still active. The deepest parts of our oceans remain alien worlds where impossible creatures continue to evolve in ways that challenge everything we think we know about the limits of life on Earth. The prehistoric oceans weren't just deeper and more dangerous than today's seas. They were biological laboratories where life conducted its most extreme experiments in survival, predation, and adaptation. And somewhere in the deepest trenches of our modern oceans, those experiments are still continuing, hidden from our view in waters so deep and dark that they might as well be on another planet. So, there you have it. 500 million years of oceanic nightmare fuel that makes today's scariest sea creatures look like stuffed animals. From dinner, plate-sized eyes staring through eternal darkness, to living fossils that have been perfecting the same murder strategies since before your ancestors crawled out of the primordial soup. The prehistoric oceans were essentially horror movies that ran for geological ages. And here's the thing that should really keep you up at night. We've only scratched the surface. For every terrifying ancient monster we've discovered, there are probably dozens more that dissolved into nothing, leaving zero trace of their existence. The deep ocean has always been Earth's final frontier, and it's still down there right now, hiding descendants of these prehistoric nightmares in trenches so deep we can barely reach them with our best technology. Those crushing depths that once spawned creatures with extendable jaws, 300 teeth, and the ability to survive without eating for 5 years haven't gone anywhere. They're still there, still dark, still under pressure that would turn you into paste, instantly. And evolution is still running its twisted experiments down there, creating new horrors we haven't even imagined yet. The next time you look out at the ocean and think it's scary, just remember that today's waters are basically a children's petting zoo